Hello and welcome to an episode of Great British Landscapes. We're looking at exposure blending today. This video is to go with an article in the magazine, and I'm going to be showing you how I manually blended two photographs together. So we'll start off with our dark and light picture. This is from the Glencoe image. And you see I'm opening DNG files here. So I'm going to take a look at both files to begin with to see what, if anything, I could do with them. It's the dark file has already had a couple of tweaks to it, but what I've basically done is got the exposure for the main highlights, which are around here, so that they are not quite blowing out. So around about there. And then for the light image, I'm looking in the darkest area here, and I've increased some fill light to make sure I've got some detail in here that I can recover. So I can put the dark marker on. If I they're down, you can see there's detail in there all the way through. But the main area around here, I'm going to try and bring up to something reasonably mid-tone. One thing to be wary of here is trying to work out where the blend edge is. Now between these two images, on the dark image I'm going to be trying to recover this area in the valley and possibly some detail from the tops of the hills in this cloud here. And the dark image, if I switch the blown out highlights on, I'm going to be using most of this foreground and bits of this hill and bits of this hill here. Now these images both had grads used. I may have been better off using no graduated filter and taking 3 exposures, but this is the way I've tended to work, trying to work with as few exposures as I can and try and fix things like these dark hillsides in post-processing. So now I'm happy with both of those images. We're going to open them into Photoshop. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the light image on top and paste it on top of the dark image. Now these aren't going to be lined up, I imagine, so let's just switch them on and off briefly. No, they're way off from each other, so I'm not even sure if these were taken pointing in the same direction. I may have adjusted the camera in between. It certainly looks like it. So what I do is I decrease the opacity of the top layer, choose the layer move tool and move around until it's close. And then after that I use the arrow keys, go left and right until it gets the sharpest, which is probably about there, and then I go up and down just to see where it's sharpest there. So if I put the opacity back up, we can see now that this is lining up around this highlight area fairly well. If we go over to another part of the picture, say in the far corner, we might see that this is still lining up okay, but I was expecting to see a slight bit of rotation. And I was going to say it wouldn't matter, because we only need to make sure that the area that we are blending lines up. So let's take a look at the pictures again. What I like to do when I'm blending these is to try and manipulate the layers to try and get them to match up fairly close. So without blowing out the highlights, I shall increase the brightness of the shadows, and with a highlight picture I shall try and decrease the brightness of the highlights. This is trying to make my merging job a bit easier. Now it doesn't matter how dark I make this picture to a certain extent, because the information will still be in this file. So now I'm sort of close. I'm going to try a rough fix to begin with, and a rough fix is done by taking Let's switch on that layer there. So we've got the highlights looking as we want them. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into the channel selector and we're going to drag the RGB channel onto this little dotted circle. And what that does is it creates a selection based on the brightness of the image. So if we go back to the how do I visualize that? If I go back to here and I create a mask from this, so I'm going to create a layer mask. I can never remember which one way around it is. If we're going to reveal selection from it just to see what happens. And typically I think I've got that the wrong way around, but that's okay because I can click on the mask and do Apple I to invert it. So I'm going to just click on that. So this is what my selection looked like. So by taking the channels, dragging the RGB channel down onto that circular dotted line, I create a mask that corresponds to the luminosity of that layer. Now, what we've got here is roughly what we wanted. We're masking off the area that's probably blown out in our picture. So let's go back a second, and we can see now inside here we've got quite a nice looking sky. What we really want is probably all of that blending in though. So if I select that and paint in, I can either paint on here or I can use the levels control. And this is something I found out was quite handy. In fact, I can do Apple M and I can adjust the levels control for the mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the black point so that it blacks out the whole of this area I'm interested in. And I'm also going to lift the white point so that I'm not really using anything from the foreground around here. So what I've created here is a mask that allows everything from the bottom layer through here. Let's take a look how it works. Switch that off again. So this is our top layer without the mask, and if I turn the mask on, it's letting through the content from the bottom layer, distributed as we can see in this picture. Now there is a danger here that some of these selections in the sky are going to end up blending things from the top layer and the bottom layer where the clouds have moved. So I'm going to take a quick look at these and I'm going to switch the mask on and off by holding down Shift and clicking on it. Now I can't see any offensive ghosting in there at all, so I'm quite happy with that. If there was any ghosting, what I could do is I could go and look at the mask and paint over this to select either the front layer or the back layer. So what we have here is a very rough blend, picking out the highlights from one layer and using the shadows and the majority of the picture on the other. Still not perfect because we've got these darker areas on either side of the hill that we'd like to boost. Now I'm going to say that these are probably best boosted using a graduated filter of some sort. Let's use a graduated filter to push up the blacks. So we're going to make a graduated selection here. And I do this by using the quick mask tool. That's the tool at the bottom of the toolbar. And I drag a graduated filter across the picture. So I'm going to drag it in approximately the place where I had my graduated filter in real life. Now what this does is the red part is the bit that isn't going to be affected and the transparent part is the bit that is going to be affected. So if I click on the quick mask again, we have a nice graduated selection. And now if we make an adjustment layer, just move that to the very top, you can see If I alt click on the mask, we've got what is probably a hardish grad across the whole picture. And now we're going to use the curves layer to boost the shadows. We want to leave the highlights mostly alone. So in order to leave the highlights alone, we click a point in the middle of the graph, a point in the top of the graph, and we can push up the bottom of the graph. Now we're not looking for a perfect looking picture here. What we're looking for is an appropriate balance in the picture. So we're trying to balance up this area that was dark, caused by the graduated filter, with these areas in the bottom, without overblowing the area around here. And I think that's fairly close. It's close enough for now anyway. Now, we have a balanced picture. The next step, I would say, is trying to correct the contrast, because we've got something that's looking very flat at the moment. So I'm going to make a selection based on the shape that I would have wanted a graduated filter to be if I could get one. Now unfortunately Lee don't sell these yet, so I make my segmented lasso connection selection, and I use refine edge. Now refine edge has changed a lot. We used to have a feather, simple apply a feather, but what we now have is lots of controls. I mostly just use this feather correction. And what it does is it blurs the edge, and I'm going to put it on maximum. The reason I do that is I tend to always try and make my corrections as broad as I possibly can, because when you start making corrections with very hard edges, it starts to show up in your work. I'd rather try and work with very broad corrections, selections, and find other ways to make things balance. So let's add a curve, an adjustment layer, and we're going to use a couple of tricks here. We're going to hold down Alt and drag this bottom slider so we can get shadow clipping information. And let's just see how these shadows come in. So we're going to lose shadows in that top right area first. Now there's two ways of getting around that. One is to only apply the black point until that starts clipping, but that leaves the rest of the picture looking very grey. Or we can apply the black point until we have just started clipping in most of the picture, and then we can make a targeted selection for this area. Now I'd rather make the targeted selection with a big feather again, and what I'm going to do here is, oops, I made an exposure adjustment instead. I'm going to use a curves adjustment on this layer, and we're going to lift those shadows. So what we're doing here is we're lifting the shadows first, and we don't want to affect the highlights too much, so we'll try and put another point in to make this curve look a bit like a upside down hockey stick. Now if we go back to the previous layer now and we adjust our black point, we can see that the black point on this hillside isn't coming in quite as fast. It's still there. What we might do is just lift those shadows completely by lifting the origin point. So what I've effectively ended up doing is just taking that left hand point and lifting it up, keeping an eye on the rest of the picture to try and get this balance sorted out. It looks like we're going to clip something in here anyway. These areas look like they're staying black, but hopefully we will have prevented most of the clipping on that hillside. So yeah, everything seems to go in roughly in the same time here. So we go across until we clip a little bit, and then we pull down the curve. So what we're doing is we're operating on little areas of the curve at a time. We've fixed the deep blacks. We're now going to operate on the dark areas. Now we can pick the next layer up and we can work on that. So we're adjusting tone. This is almost like an Ansel Adams style zone system toning, and we can adjust each point in this as the equivalent of a tone system. So now that's looking dark generally, but it's looking more balanced already. Now what about the sky? You know, we've adjusted this foreground. We'd like to do something to the sky because it's looking flat as well. Great way of doing this is clicking on a layer mask, right clicking on it, and we can choose add mask to selection, and that gives us our selection back we originally set up. We can now use select inverse, or I think the shortcut is Apple Shift I or Control Shift I if you're on Windows, and we have the selection just for the sky area. So we'll now put another curve in and we'll adjust the sky until we start getting some tonality back in. So we want contrast in, and contrast it always looks like an S-curve, so let's put a lot of contrast in so you can see what it's doing. There we go, there's a heavy dose of contrast, the classic S-curve. And the steep part of the curve applied to the majority of the picture, which is these highlights, gives us the sort of response we want. We don't tend to operate with the endpoints as much, because if we pull an endpoint in, we can see it starts to clip pretty much immediately. So that top end is the area in between the two valleys, and this bottom end is the darkest clouds and the very tops of the hills. Now, if I switch that on and off, you can see we've put some contrast back into that sky. And I'm happy with that. Now, we're going to put another layer in. Now we're going to try and apply an overall curve. I'm still struggling here, so I'm going to go back to my wrong one. I'm going to go back to my ground selection. I'll try and add some contrast in at this point here. So let's boost up the here we go. That's where we want it. Again, I don't want to play with the top end of this too much, because even though it's only a selection for the ground, it's still going to affect that clipping point there. That looks a lot better. Let's go back to the sky a second and see what making changes here does. And it seems there's no hard and fast rules. What you can see is I'm adjusting that dark point, you can start to see the tops of these mountains going a little bit dark. But because of this beam of light coming across, it doesn't look too bad. I don't think it looks false. Okay, I'm going to save that now. Give it a temporary name. Let's call it Glencoe Blend Part 1. One of the things I want to do now is use a shadow highlight tool to see how that gives me some shadow recovery. But I can only do that on a flattened layer. So that's why I've saved everything I've got so far, so I can always come back to it. So let's give shadow highlight a go to see what happens. Now I'm picking a radius, making sure it's around the sort of 400 pixel mark. I'm at 400 pixels on here to give you an idea. Let's come out of there for a second and show you what 400 pixels is. That's 400 pixels radius. So those are the sort of features it will be boosting and darkening when I do a shadow highlight. So let's see how it looks. Image, adjust, shadow highlight. So that's the 400 that we had before. The tonal width is whether it's working on the shadows, the very dark shadows or not. So if I put the tonal width right down and I do boosting, it will only work on the darkest areas, which are down the bottom here. As I increase the tonal width, it starts to work on lighter and lighter parts of the picture. And if I put it right up, then it's boosting loads of the picture and it's getting quite bright. So what I want to do really is I want to lift the very darkest bits of the picture, so I can put a large amount on and just lift this tonal width until I'm happy with what it's doing to the picture. So let's leave it there. That looks okay. Then I can turn the amount down until it doesn't look too bad. And then let's just play with the radius a little bit. I like to use as large a radius as I can get away with for that reality thing again. So let's go to 400. Now highlights, we've almost blown these highlights, and I know they're not blown because we never applied any clipping curves adjustments. So let's put a bit of highlight control in. Let's put that radius to the point where I can start to see these highlights coming in. So if I put lots in, I can see that I need to come down to around 200 odd pixels before it clips the highlights. Tonal width here does the same thing but in reverse. So this is working out what is going to be recovered by the shadow highlight tool in the highlights. So as I increase it, it's going to operate on more and more highlights. I might need to reduce my radius there to get some of it working in there. There we go. I don't want these clouds going darker than these clouds. That will look wrong. So let's see how that looks. I see that's not looking too bad now. So I would say I'm happy with that as an exposure blend, and my next step would be to start being creative in terms of curves adjustment. So I would try to work out, do I want this lightened or do I want to darken up this corner in terms of vignetting? But the basic job's been done. That's got me to where I can start operating on the file in a creative way. So let's move on to the knuckle stone, which is a Peak District picture I've worked on. I'm going to save that as a flat version. In the knuckle stone picture, I've got 3 originals that I've used for some of the blending. Now I'm not sure whether I'm going to use all 3 of those layers, but we'll give it a go. So what we have is a very dark layer, and I've done some work on this already. Again, if I reset everything, how do I reset things? Reset camera raw defaults. So starting on the darkest one, the bits I'm going to take, if anything, from these are the very darkest area at the top. So let's turn the exposure down a bit and turn recovery up until we've got hardly any clipping on the top there. And then we'll take the middle shot and let's see what recovery does on this. I think recovery probably goes as far as we need. We probably won't need that darkest shot because I could look on this and say, well, it may be clipping next to where that sun's coming out. If I turn that clipping off for a moment, I don't think I would want anything else. If I took that all the way down there. I'm just going to get white anyway. That's clipped. And if I go back to the previous picture at 100% to see what it could look like. Yeah, whatever I do, that looks like it's going to clip. So I'm going to say that I'm happy with only 2 files for my blend. Let's go back to fit in view. Let's put a bit of fill light in. And you could say that that's probably not a bad file on its own, but let's say we're going to use the bottom half of this file. So effectively this is a blend of 2 halves. And that's probably way too light for what we'd ever want. So let's turn the exposure down on that a little bit. So we get something nice across the middle and the foreground. Select both of those and open them. Okay, I'm going to take the brightest, place over the darkest. There's no rule which one you should place over each other. And I'm going to do the simplest job, as simple a job as possible here. First is to take a selection, covering up the highlight and the edges. And that selection is going to get some of the dark edges, so I'm going to use a lasso tool selection instead. I'm going to refine the edge to give myself a feather. I'll make it as broad as I can. And then I'm going to use layer mask, hide selection. So now we've got the top layer is for the foreground and the bottom layer is for the sky. So let's go to the bottom layer for a minute, and we want to, and the sky's got everything in we want, but it's obviously too dark. So let's apply a curve to that to line things up. And the main thing we want to lighten up, I think, probably is that cloud. I'd say that's probably acceptable. It's balanced with that ground there, okay. If we go to the foreground, we can say that's probably not looking too bad. I'm going to apply a curve directly to that just to increase the contrast of it slightly. So I'm going to darken using a curve. I'm going to grab the end of it and line the highlights. Maybe push the middles up slightly. Now, as far as a blend goes, I'd say that's not too bad. Creatively wise, this foreground is just way too bright for that rock. So I'm just going to make a selection, use the feather tool, and I'm going to apply a darkening curve to that foreground. And again, we're not looking for perfect luminosity across the whole picture. What we're looking for is an overall balance, because as a last task, we can apply a final curve to the whole picture. Save our work so far, which will be Knuckle Stone Part 1. And we can flatten things and try a little bit of shadow highlight. the shadows first. Go for the broadest we can. That got to a couple of thousand pixels. So you can see roughly what it's selecting. Turn the amount up. And really, I use the shadow highlight tool as a way of creating an overall balance in a picture. If I switch that off, hasn't done much, but it's some of the darker shadows at the bottom is just lifted slightly. And the highlights, I'm not sure it needs much in the highlights here. I think we've already done most of what we needed to do. And I'd say that's an okay job. So I'll save that out and we can compare it with the results we got from the HDR programs.